clientele and power is still in place. And this is very much demonstrated by the recent parliamentary elections in Egypt. The faces that are coming up back to election are more or less the same economic, the private sector icons, and also the political powers, that pre-revolution kind of powers. And this is also perpetuated by the remaining of the bureaucracy very much intact. So administrative reforms are very slow. Political reforms are superficial, more or less. So end of the day, this is resulting in the third challenge, which is that the same perceptions and approaches of dealing with slums remains the same. The thinking of sanitizing the city from slums, and as the report or the newsletter was showing, moving them somewhere, dealing with the issue at the side. All this technocratic approach of dealing with slums is going to stay so long as also the same trends, political trends and economic trends are continuing. Trying to be a little bit optimistic and looking at the opportunities, I think also talking about opportunities generally, I think the best approach to identifying opportunities is to think how to transform the challenges themselves into an opportunity. So this is something that is very important. Yes, the report talked about social justice, the need for social justice, government response by trying to have this programs, national programs of dealing with slums in Morocco, in Egypt, Tunisia, and so on. I think there's also some pushing from international agencies like the UN Habitat, GIZ, and others for different approaches, participatory approaches of dealing with slums, and more citywide programs, and so on. But I think a big part of the opportunity lies within the areas, the slum areas themselves, and the strive of the slum dwellers to engage in society and being innovative in that respect. In one area, just saying that in one area, Masjid Nasser, that area that Riham mentioned, an informal area, squatter settlement that is more than 8,000 inhabitants. It houses more than 5,000 small workshops, productive workshops, not only for plastic recycling, but also for artifacts that are being sold in the Khan Khalili, the touristic place in the historic city, up to all metalwork production, everything. So these dynamics, people are trying to solve their own issues and to capture their own opportunities in the city, but also in an innovative way. And I think one of the main entry points is to see how can we capitalize on these social assets that are being there in these areas. So just to conclude, in my perspective, the opportunities are limited and not utilized well. Challenges are big, but this puts a lot of responsibility on experts and civil society to try to work on the right solutions. And I hope that this workshop actually will help. I usually engage in, and I teach and I practice strategic planning. And I think this futuristic looking and trying to have a common ground of a vision for the future is very important. It's very much an integral part of strategic planning. So I hope in the coming workshop we will be able to see what is the improved image of a slum. So if slum is the current reality that we don't like, so what would be the alternative? Is it if we refuse, okay, the sanitized city without slums where they have managed to hide people, the dwellers of the slum somewhere, either in public housing units or wherever? No, this is not the image. Okay, so what would be the alternative image? This is something that is very interesting to look forward to work on in the coming session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled. Thanks. Our next speaker and the last one will be Dr. Geshi Sabina of South African Cities Network, and her subject will be looking at urban development and informal growth in sub-Saharan Africa to look at the policies and the trends. Geshi.
So my intention is to compensate for the lack of previous slides with having too many slides. But most of them are just pictures, facilitator. Don't worry, I don't intend to read them. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and actually I think it follows quite well from the previous two inputs. This is pretty much the only statistic I will put, because the report already indicates the scale of sort of informal settlement in Africa, over 60%. And that's compared with 30% in Asia and about 24% in Latin America and the Caribbean. In absolute numbers, obviously still smaller than Asia, but as a percent, obviously of some concern. I think perhaps what's significant in this slide is that there are differences, and like the previous speaker mentioned, there are actually differences even from settlement to settlement, but even between countries. So you've got places like, I think Central African Republic has 96% of informal settlement. Of course, it does raise these questions of how are these things defined, but what I want to just get into are what some of the development issues have been from my perspective in terms of some of the paradoxes of how we think about urbanization and urban settlement, some of the concepts, and maybe some lines of questioning. You don't have to look at me, you can just look at the slides, because I will not be reading them. I think one of the big paradoxes is that our cities have very much grown, in terms of what you see in the back there, and that tends to be our imaginary of how cities ought to be. But the reality of what cities are from very many people in Africa is really quite far from that. But it's not just the settlement, again, as the previous speaker said, it's also the whole system and how we understand development and what it means, and what good means, and for whom, and what is acceptable, and for whom. What's really interesting as well, I think, is that the urban or city agenda has gained a lot of momentum in recent years. I mean, you almost cannot go anywhere and not talk about cities almost in any sector or space, which was not the case just a decade ago, by the way. And whether it's seeing cities as a market or a growth source, which I think is the case in terms of seeing cities as engines of growth for national economies that are struggling, or as marketplaces for smart tech or for whatever else one is looking for. But that counted against a very strong anti-city movement and anti-urban sensibility. Certainly the country where I live, South Africa, still very much has this idea that somehow speaking about city and addressing urban issues is somehow counter to some preference to address rural underdevelopment and this preference or emotional connection we have with the rural. Also, the other paradox, of course, being inequality. Again, I come from a country that is, I think, probably now the most unequal country in the world. And a lot of the discourse around the urbanization and the growth of the middle class and the growth prospects we see in cities is coupled with a very strong unequal sense of how that works and what's happening. Africa is the fastest growing market for luxury. Incidentally, South Africa and Morocco currently top Africa in terms of the presence of directly operated luxury stores, but very rapidly growing in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in other countries. So the nature of our growth is a growth actually towards this. It's not a growth towards addressing the first cartoon that I saw in terms of people accessing that dream. It's in fact a very elusive dream for many people. Consumption. So my summary actually changes, actually US inequality. I've now made it sub-Saharan inequality. Is very much a case of a ship in many people's view that is really sinking, but it depends on where you sit on it, whether you believe that it's sinking or not. So what have the issues been in terms of informal settlements specifically? Largely the discourse is one of deprivation. Does this thing have a pointer? Can something here point? Which is the pointer? The middle. Okay. So yeah, thank you. Very much in terms of the deprivations. So what it is that these physical places lack and the kind of vulnerabilities that people face within them. There's a very strong element of illegality, which again the newsletter and other people have raised in terms of those places. What I don't mention here, but I think came through nicely from the previous speaker, is also the politics of these slums or informal places. So whether it's in Kenya, where you hear about vote banking and the sort of election politics that play out around informal places, or in places like South Africa, where essentially there are permanent tax and rate holidays for people who live in particular areas, again to serve quite a political agenda. We hear in places like Dar es Salaam about how in fact the provision of formal services are more likely in informal settlements than they are in formal settlements. And again, it's a question of where the numbers are.